Question 18, Part 1 of Summa Theologica, Pars Prima Secundae, on the last end and on human acts. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Summa Theologica, Pars Prima Secundae, on the last end and on human acts, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. Question 18, Part 1 of the good and evil of human acts in general, in 11 articles. We must now consider the good and evil of human acts. First, how a human act is good or evil. Secondly, what results from the good or evil of a human act, as merit or demerit, sin and guilt. Under the first head there will be a threefold consideration. The first will be of the good and evil of human acts in general, the second of the good and evil of internal acts, and the third of the good and evil of external acts. Concerning the first, there are 11 points of inquiry. 1. Whether every human action is good, or are there evil actions? 2. Whether the good or evil of a human action is derived from its object? 3. Whether it is derived from a circumstance? 4. Whether it is derived from the end? 5. Whether a human action is good or evil in its species? 6. Whether an action has the species of good or evil from its end? 7. Whether the species derived from the end is contained under the species derived from the object, as under its genus, or conversely. 8. Whether any action is indifferent in its species. 9. Whether an individual action can be indifferent. 10. Whether a circumstance places a moral action in the species of good or evil. 11. Whether every circumstance that makes an action better or worse places the moral action in the species of good or evil. First article. Whether every human action is good, or are there evil actions? Objection 1. It would seem that every human action is good, and that none is evil. For Dionysius says (Divine Names 4) that evil acts not, save in virtue of the good. But no evil is done in the virtue of the good. Therefore no action is evil. Objection 2. Further, nothing acts except in so far as it is an act. Now a thing is evil, not according as it is an act, but according as its potentiality is void of act: whereas in so far as its potentiality is perfected by act, it is good, as stated in Metaph. ix, 9. Therefore nothing acts in so far as it is evil, but only according as it is good. Therefore every action is good, and none is evil. Obj. 3. Further, evil cannot be a cause, save accidentally, as Dionysius declares (Divine Names 4). But every action has some effect which is proper to it. Therefore no action is evil, but every action is good. On the contrary, our Lord said (John 3:20): "Every one that doth evil hateth the light." Therefore some actions of man are evil. I answer that, We must speak of good and evil in actions, as of good and evil in things. Because such as everything is, such is the act that it produces. Now in things each one has so much good as it has being, since good and being are convertible, as was stated in the first part. Question 5, Articles 1, 3. But God alone has the whole plenitude of His being in a certain unity, whereas every other thing has its proper fullness of being in a certain multiplicity. Wherefore it happens with some things that they have being in some respect, and yet they are lacking in the fullness of being due to them. Thus, the fullness of human being requires a compound of soul and body, having all the powers and instruments of knowledge and movement. Wherefore, if any man be lacking in any of these, he is lacking in something due to the fullness of his being. So that as much as he has of being, so much has he of goodness, while so far as he is lacking in goodness, and is said to be evil. Thus a blind man is possessed of goodness, inasmuch as he lives, and of evil, inasmuch as he lacks sight. That, however, which has nothing of being or goodness, could not be said to be either evil or good. But, since this same fullness of being is of the very essence of good, if a thing be lacking in its due fullness of being, it is not said to be good simply, but in a certain respect, inasmuch as it is a being, although it can be called a being simply, and a non-being in a certain respect, as was stated in the first part, Question 5, Article 1 and 1. We must therefore say every action has goodness, insofar as it has being, whereas it is lacking in goodness, insofar as it is lacking in something that is due to its fullness of being, and thus it is said to be evil. For instance, if it lacks the quantity determined by reason, or its due place, or something of the kind. Reply Obj. 1. Evil acts in virtue of deficient goodness. For if there were nothing of good there would be neither being nor possibility of action. On the other hand, if good were not deficient, there would be no evil. Consequently, the action done is a deficient good, which is good in a certain respect, but simply evil. Reply Obj. 2. Nothing hinders a thing from being in act in a certain respect, so that it can act, and in a certain respect deficient in act, so as to cause a deficient act. Thus a blind man has in act the power of walking, whereby he is able to walk. But inasmuch as he is deprived of sight, he suffers a defect in walking by stumbling when he walks. Reply Obj. 3. An evil action can have a proper effect, according to the goodness and being that it has. Thus adultery is the cause of human generation, inasmuch as it implies union of male and female, but not inasmuch as it lacks the order of reason. Second article. Whether the good or evil of a man's action is derived from its object? Objection 1. It would seem that the good or evil of an action is not derived from its object. For the object of any action is a thing. But, evil is not in things, but in the sinner's use of them, as Augustine says on Christian Teaching 3:12. Therefore the good or evil of a human action is not derived from their object. Obj. 2. Further, the object is compared to the action as its matter. But the goodness of a thing is not from its matter, but rather from the form, which is an act. Therefore good and evil in actions is not derived from their object. Obj. 3. Further, the object of an active power is compared to the action as effect to cause. But the goodness of a cause does not depend on its effect, rather it is the reverse. Therefore good or evil in actions is not derived from their objects. On the contrary, it is written (Osee 9:10), "They became abominable, as those things which they loved." Now man becomes abominable to God on account of the malice of his action. Therefore the malice of his action is according to the evil objects that man loves, and the same applies to the goodness of his action. I answer that, as stated above (A. 1), the good or evil of an action, as of other things, depends on its fullness of being or lack of that fullness. Now the first thing that belongs to the fullness of being seems to be that which gives a thing its species. And just as a natural thing has its species from its form, so an action has its species from its object, as movement from its term. And therefore, just as the primary goodness of a natural thing is derived from its form, which gives it its species, so the primary goodness of a moral action is derived from its suitable object. Hence some call such an action "good in its genus," for instance, "to make use of what is one's own." And just as in natural things the primary evil is when a generated thing does not realize its specific form, for instance, if instead of a man something else be generated, so the primary evil in moral actions is that which is from the object, for instance, "to take what belongs to another," and this action is said to be "evil in its genus," genus here standing for species, just as we apply the term mankind to the whole human species. Reply Obj. 1: Although external things are good in themselves, nevertheless they have not always a due proportion to this or that action; and so, inasmuch as they are considered as objects of such actions, they have not the quality of goodness. Reply Obj. 2: The object is not the matter of which a thing is made, but the matter about which something is done, and stands in relation to the act as its form, as it were, through giving it its species. Reply Obj. 3: The object of the human action is not always the object of an active power: for the appetitive power is in a way passive, in so far as it is moved by the appetible object; and yet it is a principle of human actions. Nor again have the objects of the active powers always the nature of an effect, but only when they are already transformed. Thus food, when transformed, is the effect of the nutritive power, whereas food before being transformed stands in relation to the nutritive power as the matter about which it exercises its operation. Now since the object is in some way the effect of the active power, it follows that it is the term of its action, and consequently that it gives it its form and species, since movement derives its species from its term. Moreover, although the goodness of an action is not caused by the goodness of its effect, yet an action is said to be good from the fact that it can produce a good effect. Consequently, the very proportion of an action to its effect is the measure of its goodness. Third article: Whether man's action is good or evil from a circumstance? Objection 1: It would seem that an action is not good or evil from a circumstance. For circumstances stand around (circumstant) an action, as being outside it, as stated above (Q. 7, A. 1). But "good and evil are in things themselves," as stated in Metaph. iv, 4. Therefore an action does not derive goodness or malice from a circumstance. Obj. 2: Further, the goodness or malice of an action is considered principally in the doctrine of morals. But since circumstances are accidents of actions, it seems that they are outside the scope of art: because "no art takes notice of what is accidental" (Metaph. vi, 2). Therefore the goodness or malice of an action is not taken from a circumstance. Obj. 3: Further, that which belongs to a thing in respect of its substance is not ascribed to it in respect of an accident. But good and evil belong to an action in respect of its substance, because an action can be good or evil in its genus, as stated above (A. 2). Therefore an action is not good or bad from a circumstance. On the contrary, the Philosopher says (Ethic. ii, 3) that a virtuous man acts as he should, and when he should, and so on in respect of the other circumstances. Therefore, on the other hand, the vicious man, in the matter of each vice, acts when he should not, or where he should not, and so on with the other circumstances. Therefore human actions are good or evil according to circumstances. I answer that, in natural things it is to be noted that the whole fullness of perfection due to a thing is not from the mere substantial form that gives it its species, since a thing derives much from supervening accidents, as man does from shape, color, and the like. And if any one of these accidents be out of due proportion, evil is the result. So it is with action. For the plenitude of its goodness does not consist wholly in its species, but also in certain additions which accrue to it by reason of certain accidents, and such are its due circumstances. Wherefore, if something be wanting that is requisite as a due circumstance, the action will be evil. Reply Obj. 1. Circumstances are outside an action, inasmuch as they are not part of its essence, but they are in an action as accidents thereof. Thus, too, accidents in natural substances are outside the essence. Reply Obj. 2. Every accident is not accidentally in its subject, for some are proper accidents, and of these every art takes notice. And thus it is that the circumstances of actions are considered in the doctrine of morals. Reply Obj. 3. Since good and being are convertible, according as being is predicated of substance and of accident, so is good predicated of a thing both in respect of its essential being and in respect of its accidental being, and this both in natural things and in moral actions. Fourth Article. Whether a human action is good or evil from its end? Objection 1. It would seem that the good and evil in human actions are not from the end. For Dionysius says (Div. Nom. iv) that "nothing acts with a view to evil." If therefore an action were good or evil from its end, no action would be evil, which is clearly false. Obj. 2. Further, the goodness of an action is something in the action, but the end is an extrinsic cause. Therefore an action is not said to be good or bad according to its end. Obj. 3. Further, a good action may happen to be ordained to an evil end, as when a man gives an alms from vainglory; and conversely, an evil action may happen to be ordained to a good end, as a theft committed in order to give something to the poor. Therefore an action is not good or evil from its end. On the contrary, Boethius says (De Differ. ii) that "if the end is good, the thing is good; and if the end be evil, the thing also is evil." I answer that, The disposition of things as to goodness is the same as their disposition as to being. Now in some things the being does not depend on another, and in these it suffices to consider their being absolutely. But there are things the being of which depends on something else, and hence in their regard we must consider their being in its relation to the cause on which it depends. Now just as the being of a thing depends on the agent and the form, so the goodness of a thing depends on its end. Hence in the Divine Persons, whose goodness does not depend on another, the measure of goodness is not taken from the end: whereas human actions and other things, the goodness of which depends on something else, have a measure of goodness from the end on which they depend, besides that goodness which is in them absolutely. Accordingly, a fourfold goodness may be considered in a human action. First, that which, as an action, it derives from its genus; because as much as it has of action and being, so much has it of goodness, as stated above (A. 1). Secondly, it has goodness according to its species, which is derived from its suitable object. Thirdly, it has goodness from its circumstances, in respect as it were of its accidents. Fourthly, it has goodness from its end, to which it is compared as to the cause of its goodness. Reply Obj. 1: The good in view of which one acts is not always a true good, but sometimes it is a true good, sometimes an apparent good, and in the latter event an evil action results from the end in view. Reply Obj. 2: Although the end is an extrinsic cause, nevertheless due proportion to the end and relation to the end are inherent to the action. Reply Obj. 3: Nothing hinders an action that is good in one of the ways mentioned above, from lacking goodness in another way; and thus it may happen that an action which is good in its species or in its circumstances is ordained to an evil end, or vice versa. However, an action is not good simply, unless it is good in all these ways, since "evil results from any single defect, but good from the complete cause," as Dionysius says (Div. Nom. iv). _Fifth Article. Whether a human action is good or evil in its species? Objection 1: It would seem that good and evil in moral actions do not make a difference of species. For the existence of good and evil in actions is in conformity with their existence in things, as stated above (A. 1). But good and evil do not make a specific difference in things, for a good man is specifically the same as a bad man. Therefore neither do they make a specific difference in actions. Obj. 2: Further, since evil is a privation, it is a non-being. But non-being cannot be a difference, according to the Philosopher (Metaph. iii, 3). Since therefore the difference constitutes the species, it seems that an action is not constituted in a species through being evil. Consequently, good and evil do not diversify the species of human actions. Obj. 3: Further, acts that differ in species produce different effects. But the same specific effect results from a good and from an evil action. Thus a man is born of adulterous or of lawful wedlock. Therefore good and evil actions do not differ in species. Obj. 4: Further, actions are sometimes said to be good or bad from a circumstance, as stated above (A. 3). But since a circumstance is an accident, it does not give an action its species. Therefore human actions do not differ in species on account of their goodness or malice. On the contrary, according to the Philosopher (Ethic. ii, 1), "like habits produce like actions." But a good and a bad habit differ in species, as liberality and prodigality. Therefore also good and bad actions differ in species. I answer that, Every action derives its species from its object, as stated above (A. 2). Hence it follows that a difference of object causes a difference of species in actions. Now it must be observed that a difference of objects causes a difference of species in actions, according as the latter are referred to one active principle, which does not cause a difference in actions, according as they are referred to another active principle. Because nothing accidental constitutes a species, but only that which is essential. And a difference of object may be essential in reference to one active principle, and accidental in reference to another. Thus to know color and to know sound differ essentially in reference to sense, but not in reference to the intellect. Now in human actions, good and evil are predicated in reference to the reason, because as Dionysius says (Div. Nom. iv), "the good of man is to be in accordance with reason," and evil is "to be against reason." For that is good for a thing which suits it in regard to its form, and evil that which is against the order of its form. It is therefore evident that the difference of good and evil, considered in reference to the object, is an essential difference in relation to reason. That is to say, according as the object is suitable or unsuitable to reason. Now certain actions are called human or moral, inasmuch as they proceed from the reason. Consequently it is evident that good and evil diversify the species in human actions, since essential differences cause a difference of species. Reply Obj. 1: Even in natural things, good and evil, inasmuch as something is according to nature and something against nature, diversify the natural species, for a dead body and a living body are not of the same species. In like manner, good, inasmuch as it is in accord with reason, and evil, inasmuch as it is against reason, diversify the moral species. Reply Obj. 2: Evil implies privation, not absolute, but affecting some potentiality. For an action is said to be evil in its species, not because it has no object at all, but because it has an object in disaccord with reason; for instance, to appropriate another's property. Wherefore, in so far as the object is something positive, it can constitute the species of an evil act. Reply Obj. 3: The conjugal act and adultery, as compared to reason, differ specifically, and have effects specifically different, because the other deserves praise and reward, the other blame and punishment. But as compared to the generative power, they do not differ in species; thus they have one specific effect. Reply Obj. 4: A circumstance is sometimes taken as the essential difference of the object, as compared to reason, and then it can specify a moral act. And it must needs be so whenever a circumstance transforms an action from good to evil: for a circumstance would not make an action evil, except through being repugnant to reason. End of Question 18, Part 1.